Hi, good evening, everyone. So there's a cast iron law of conferences that, oh, these lights are bright. If you're an American, you have to begin your speech with a joke. But if you're British, as I am, and Dave is, you have to begin with an apology. That's the difference between the nations. So I'm going to apologize for a couple of things, actually. One is that my first degree was also in philosophy. So perhaps there's something going on that attracts us to this kind of thinking. The other apology I'm going to make is that I'm going to begin by saying something which I think is interestingly unpopular in this audience. And I want to start by affirming something that I think we lose sight of. When we talk about how important it is to change the aid system and to improve it, we should also affirm that, in large part, it works. And this photograph is one that I took last week near my home in Ethiopia. In fact, I live just behind that green hedge. This is a primary school about 200 meters away from my house. So every morning I see these kids that you see here going to school. And this is an extraordinary change compared to the first time I visited Ethiopia 25 years ago. Even 15 years ago, just after the present government came to power, there were about a quarter of the kids in Ethiopia were attending primary school. And then look what's happened. I could do a Hans Rosling. Here comes the new government, and here comes the donors. And so here we are now, in the present year, where over 80% of Ethiopian children are attending primary school regularly, 84%. And that's a huge change in people's lives. That's a huge change not just in the potential of the country, but in the individual lives of those people. And of that, about 8 million of those children go to school because of foreign aid. About a third of Ethiopia's school spending is financed from abroad. So when we talk about how important it is to make the aid system work better, which it is, let's not forget to celebrate how much difference aid is making today. Let's not forget to learn from those successes, but also let's not, as we strive for perfection and for improvement, let's keep in mind that we are making a difference, that you are all making a difference in the work you do, and our colleagues around the world who are working in aid are making a big difference. And then you get headlines. I don't know who reads the Globe and Mail here, but this was Wednesday's paper, Hope in Ruins in Haiti. And all the press has been full of stories 1 year on. How is it possible that we could still be in such a terrible situation? And how is it possible that after Aceh we didn't learn the lessons, and that we have made exactly the same mistakes in Haiti as we made in Aceh? So there's clearly a problem, and a lot of the conference that we've been talking about has been about what is wrong with this system. What all of us feel, that those of you who've worked abroad have experienced, for many of us, really quite profound kind of cognitive dissonance about this system isn't working as we think it should be. So my starting point is that aid works, but not as well as it should. And I want to keep hold of the aid works part of that message. And there are some examples of this that are quite well known. Lack of predictability in aid. That's something we ought to be able to fix, right? Lack of predictability. It's costing somewhere between 50 and 20% of the value of the aid we give. That's a huge value lost. We know that tying of aid reduces its value by somewhere between 20 and 30%. Now, Engineers Without Borders did a great thing in persuading the Canadian government to untie its aid. And I come from a country that has largely untied its aid. In theory, legally, we've completely untied its aid, but it's interesting that even in countries that allegedly have untied their aid, there's still a lot of it is tied. I want to focus on one particular example of this, which is the proliferation of aid projects. This is the data. This is the number of projects that have been started up since 1973. And as you can see, the Paris agenda of we're going to have a smaller number of activities, we're going to channel our money through the government, we're going to simplify and harmonize, isn't really happening. There's a huge growth, but of donors, of organizations, of multilateral funds, of NGOs. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, this is good, right? This is because there are more donors, there's more money, that's why there's more aid. So let's look at what's happening to average project size. Yeah, not so good. Average project size is falling. The average project size for bilateral aid is now less than $100,000. That's the mean. There's this huge number of aid projects now. And living in a developing country, and many of you who worked in developing countries will have seen the chaos in the aid system of all these different projects, all these different activities, all these different NGOs. So why is that happening? We've made a political declaration that this isn't what we want, that this isn't the nature of the aid relationship we're trying to build. So here's a very simple model. So the effects of proliferation. Presumably the ideal number of donors is not 0 and it's not 1. It's you probably want 2 or 3. You want a bit of competition, a bit of learning from each other and so on. But as the number of donors goes up and the number of projects goes up, the benefits of aid seem to go down pretty quickly. You get a lot of inefficiency, a lot of transactions costs, a lot of duplication, a lot of people falling over each other. So where you really want to be is on that yellow spot. You want to be at the optimum there. Is this going to work? Yeah, you want to be up here, obviously. So why don't we just go there? Well, now look at the politics of aid and aid proliferation. And this is simplifying a lot of different things on one graph, but governments want to respond to all the different advocates, and they want your country to be investing in Eritrea and Mali and Burkina Faso and all these different countries. They want to be investing in every sector. There's an NGO somewhere that wants the government to be involved in everything and will complain very loudly if your government says, no, we're just not going to do that. And there are agency staff who feel very strongly about the thing they work on, and they want to go on working on it. They don't want to close down and move on somewhere else, and they want to protect their jobs and their livelihoods. And there are NGOs who are frankly rent-seeking, who are trying to get contracts from government, so they want the government to be doing more of those kinds of things. So there are all these incentives to proliferate more, and political pain for a government that reduces the amount of projects that they run. So what's the equilibrium? Well, you want to be up here, but clearly we're actually going to be down here. We're going to be at the point where these benefits cross. And that's what happens. The aid system is locked in a deep political equilibrium. We want, of course, to maximize poverty reduction. We want to maximize the development benefits of the aid we give, but we've also got to deal with all those political pressures and political constraints and institutional constraints and individual incentives and agency incentives, which lead us to be somewhere else. And the Paris Agenda and the Accra Agenda for Action basically say, oh, starting now, we're going to be here. We're just going to move. Okay, well, I mean, what's wrong with this picture? That isn't going to happen, right? You can announce that it would be better if you were somewhere else, but the equilibrium isn't at the optimum. And if we want to address this, we have to change the equilibrium. We have to change the drivers that led us to where we are today, not simply issue a communique saying that we would like to be somewhere else. Now, there may be some effect from issuing a communique. It's possible that green line shifts a bit because it becomes politically less attractive to proliferate. Because some NGOs Engineers Without Borders will make a fuss that the government hasn't reduced the number of aid projects than it should. But that's just going to lead to a very slight shift in this line a bit further up here. It's going to move us just here. It's not going to move us up to the optimum. We've got to figure out, Dave had a resonant phrase about how do we, I wrote it down but I've lost it, how do we modify the system that we're operating within? How do we modify the constraints? How do we modify the equilibrium? In a previous session, somebody said that in a kind of TED-style talk, you should enunciate 3 rather general principles That's the way to do it. That's what a TED Talk is all about. You start with a story, and then you enunciate 3 principles. So here are some principles. One is that we have to change the equilibrium rather than try to move away from it. So we have to understand what's driving it and then change it. The second is that if we want this system to evolve, and this very much echoes what Dave was saying, we need the variation and selection in the system that will, we need to be adaptive. We need the mechanisms that learn from what's happening and change and respond to those as time goes by. We can't begin with a master plan. So one way of thinking about that is that we don't start off by thinking, where do we want the world to be? We start off by thinking, how do we build better feedback loops to make that evolution process work? And a third point, and this came out for me a lot in the discussions today, is that if organizations face challenges making the right decision and doing the right thing day by day, maybe it's easier for them to make decisions about systems that make it difficult then for them to make the wrong decision later. So an example in economics is the independence of the central bank. We set up independent central banks because governments found it difficult to control inflation properly in the run-up to general elections. But by making the right decision to put that decision at arm's length, then it was possible for those decisions to be made automatically on their behalf, and they didn't have to take those tough decisions when the time came. And maybe there's more that we can do because the actors in this system want it to work better. Maybe what they should be doing is putting a lot of these, is creating systems and rules that make it hard for them to do the wrong thing in future. So what kind of things might that look like? And what I'm trying to do here is synthesize a bit of what I understand of adaptive complex systems and evolution theory and systems talk, and think about how does that mean that we should be trying to change the system that we're trying to operate? And I'm sorry to have a slide with lots of words on it, but let me try and spell out some of these. And I offer these in the spirit of being ideas that need to be tested. It kind of goes with the whole principle here that there isn't a grand plan. What we don't try and do is design a new system. What we try to do is put into the system the things that will make it evolve in the right direction, even if we don't have a prior view about what that direction is. So we try and change the system dynamics a bit. So decentralized decision-making, trying to make sure that the people who are making the choices about what continues, what starts, what stops, what gets scaled up, what gets dampened, are people who are observing what's happening on the ground, who are close to it. Now, I think one of the questions we have to ask is what has to be true politically for that to be possible? We can't just say, right, as of now, all aid agency staff can do whatever the hell they like anytime they want because they're on the ground. We have to say, well, maybe they have to operate within a framework of reporting certain kinds of outputs and outcomes. Maybe there are things that we can do that enable us to decentralize and empower people on the ground. What would those have to be to make our treasury happy, to make our politicians happy? One reason why we make central decisions rather than decentralized decisions is that there are things that affect the system as a whole, and you don't necessarily want individuals to make those decisions based on their own context. So these are what economists call externalities, these kind of spillover effects. So if everybody is simply going to decide for themselves, then maybe we end up with, for example, a burden on a developing country of too many missions coming in. So if that's going to be a problem, rather than trying to coordinate the missions and trying to have a committee deciding, why not price them? Why not have missions permits and trade them? Have a market for missions permits. And, so you still have decentralized decision-making, but you tax the externality there that still then allows people to make sensible decisions individually. A second set of issues is about increasing transparency and accountability. This is the idea that we just need more and different information. And I think Dave's point about not having that information summarized and intermediated and aggregated, but having access to the raw data is really important. And that's something we ought to be able to achieve. NGOs, aid agencies, international organizations have a lot of information But there's also a lot more that we should be gathering from the intended beneficiaries of aid, and the kinds of tools and techniques for narratives and storytelling, and how we can aggregate that qualitative information as well as quantitative information is going to be really important in the coming years. I think that's probably going to be the biggest change we see in development, is the idea of some form of beneficiary feedback and social accountability. I would like to see, I mean, this sounds very basic, I would like to see sensible information about overhead costs and the unit costs of doing business. It just seems to me crazy that we work in a world where lots of different aid agencies are doing broadly similar things, buying textbooks and training teachers and building roads, but we don't know what the average cost of doing it is for each of those organizations. Now, I'm not saying that we should necessarily have cast iron rules about what to do with that information, but it seems to me that ought to be part of the mix, part of the decision making. If one aid agency is very expensive doing it and another is very cheap, then we ought to try and understand what's going on. So there's a kind of basic information gap that would help us have a better system. And then I think we should be thinking about how we close the feedback loops, how we make sure that success is scaled up, that ineffective behavior is damped down. And I don't think we can get there by just wishing that it was true, by saying we're going to publish. I think it's great that Engineers Without Borders is publishing a failure report. I think that's in fact, a round of applause to engineers. But how do we institutionalize the idea that if something isn't working, we're going to stop it? Because that's not a very easy thing to do. So maybe we don't rely on managerial discretion. Maybe we have rules and systems that the funding naturally flows to the organizations that are doing a better job, and you have sunset clauses and things so that organizations have to keep applying for money, and if they're not doing well, they're just not going to get it, or it's going to tail off over time. So finding ways that way to improve the feedback, but also actually empowering beneficiaries themselves. We're still stuck in the mindset that development is something we come and do to people. And a good starting point, I think, for development ought to be, why wouldn't we just give them money? Right? Are you sure that the intervention you're designing is better than just giving that person the cash and letting them decide what their priority is, which service provider they want, what it is they want to do with that money? Wouldn't for a lot of things like food, rather than giving them food, why wouldn't you give them cash and let the market provide it to them? Because there are very few circumstances in which there is not enough food. In almost all circumstances, people are hungry because they're too poor to buy it. So why not give them money? So I think we should be thinking more about how we empower beneficiaries themselves to make their own choices. And that's a form of feedback, right? Service delivery organizations who want to provide schools and hospitals and water will be responsive to those holders of money, those holders of vouchers, or whatever it might be. These are examples, and they're intended to illustrate a general point, which is they're not an image of what the development trajectory of any given country will be. I don't know whether agriculture is the answer to Ethiopia's economic growth. But I do know that if you have more responsive systems that move money towards successful activities and which tend to dampen ineffective behaviors, if you have accountability mechanisms that tend to improve service delivery, then over time the system will improve. And I don't know in what direction it will improve, but it will be more responsive to the people of Ethiopia, and it's more likely to meet their needs. And I'm not sure if I've got an example. Yeah, this is nearly the last slide. There's a study by Martina Bjorkman and Jakob Svensson, where they went to a bunch of NGO clinics and they randomized. They took half of them and they set up a project of having NGOs being trained to do feedback. They were interviewing the clients there and asking them what they thought of the service they got. You know, was the clinic good? Did they get the service they need? Was it clean? Was it open? Was there a doctor there? There was no additional money. There was no other intervention other than just this report back mechanism. And you can see behind you what happened. And I mean, the most telling figure is that infant mortality fell by a third in those clinics. This is a randomly selected group of clinics for the treatment. A third reduction in infant mortality. a far cheaper intervention than training more doctors or bringing in more drugs, was just giving the people using those services the opportunity to express an opinion about whether it was working for them or not. And what's interesting about this is we don't know how this worked. We don't know what happened in those clinics to make them better, to reduce them from, did they open longer hours, or did they see more people, or did they have better conversation? We don't know. But we do know that, so one of the things that we need to understand when we're dealing with these systems is that we should observe what happens and learn from that, but we don't need to try and predict and plan and identify what was the problem with these clinics and what is it that they need to do. If we can create the feedback loop, if we can create the accountability in the system, then the system will figure out its own way of improving and delivering the service that people need. And there are lots of examples of this, and we can talk about it in the discussion, but I mean, this is a particularly compelling one, and it's quite a rigorous study as well, which is helpful. So you're all engineers, you read Wired magazine. I'm not going to go through all this. As a kind of a summary, there are a bunch of things that we should be doing to fix the development system that are about empowering people, that are about agreeing rules of the game and decentralizing decision-making, about trying to change the incentives, trying to promote evolution, trying to learn from distributive knowledge, which I now know not to call crowdsourcing, and the wisdom of the crowd, but I'm still going to call it that. Improving transparency. Those are the kinds of things that will make the system work better, even if we don't know where the system is going. And lastly, this little girl, Mesret, she, you've all seen NGO brochures with pictures of compelling little African girls, and I'm sorry to be one of the, obviously what we need is spreadsheets, not sponsoring children. But she was a girl I met. She was a girl I met in northern Ethiopia, in Gojam, farming community. It's where a lot of the water that ends up in the Nile starts off as rainfall, so it's quite good farming land. Her mother didn't go to school at all. Her father did 1 year of school. I met her on her way to school because the Ethiopian government has put in place primary education almost everywhere in the country now. So what we're doing has worked for her, and she wants to be a doctor when she grows up, and that's something that her family couldn't have imagined. But there are girls like her around the world who we are failing, and we're failing because the system isn't working well enough. So this is really important that this is not a plea for more aid money, it's a plea for spending the money better. And we can do a better job with it so that people like Mesret, who are currently not going to school, do in future. Thanks very much.
So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Pretty interesting discussion, great thinkers. Unfortunately, our session got cut a little short because the day has been a little behind. So rather than having a discussion today, I think what we're going to have to do is, I'm going to throw out 3 questions at you guys that I think have been perplexing us overseas as we've been kind of encountering this system at a practical level. And then both the speakers will be around throughout the conference, and I really challenge you guys to go up and talk to the speakers about these things. So the 3 questions. The first one is to look at the system from like the aid sector level. And I think one of the things that troubles us overseas is that when you talk to people in the sector, everybody kind of agrees there's problems. Like, you don't really get that many people disagreeing with you. One of the biggest questions is, there's not that many change agents in the sector. So where is change going to come from? What is the mechanisms that are actually going to lead to change, and how do we shift towards this new equilibrium, given that that's the state? The second level of questioning is around the organizations that we work with. Complexity, working on the emergent and trying to figure out how to adapt as we learn and getting immediate feedback loops. Those are things that private sector that has all kinds of money, like really educated people, has a heck of a time implementing. If you look at all the organizations that have tried to copy Toyota's methods, for example, not many have been successful. So the question is, how do you build organizations that are actually able to deal with complexity? Do you need to find a way so that lower capacity organizations can deal with complexity with lower skill? Or do you have to find a way to build really high skill organizations to manage that? And the last big question is at the individual level. I think one of the things, like a lot of us have been overseas in this room, and I know I've had this conversation over and over and over again about you go overseas, you get frustrated with the system. There's a lot of things wrong with it. After you come back from EWB, you want to stay in the sector, but you don't know where to go. Do you work for the UN, or do you go work for the Gates Foundation? Do you, like, what are these things that you could do? And a lot of people are kind of frustrated and not too sure where they fit in. So the question is, how do we, as individuals, plug into the system? If we truly, really care about the changes that we're talking about, how do we play a role in this? And so, you know, there's role models out there in the larger system, like, say, Al Gore. You know, he's gone around and shifted mindsets, millions of mindsets. But there's also people in this conference, like today, Mr. Gitongo. He was, to look at somebody who's had so much courage to just stand up against, you know, a system where so much was wrong. Like, think how much courage that takes. That's one model. You look at Ned Breslin. He's here for the water talks. His organization, another person you should go up and talk to, his organization is pioneering new ways of measuring and starting to put these feedback loops in and starting to do post-project evaluations and really role modeling the sector and talking to others and telling them about what are the organizational challenges. Like, what does it really mean to operationalize these things? How do we get from rhetoric to actual implications? Like, what does it mean for your fundraising? What does it mean for being a manager and how difficult it is to run an organization? So I'm just going to leave it with you guys that those are the kind of three really concrete levels to be thinking about. And I really, really encourage you to come up and talk to overseas staff, talk amongst yourselves as well as the speakers on each of these things. Because if we're going to move towards something new, something different, we need to figure these things out. So thank you, and have a great night. So I have a couple speaker guests here to thank Dave and Owen for taking the time to share with us. It really is such a privilege to have so many really great thinkers sharing their time with us and being open to discussing and staying for the whole conference to engage with us on these issues. So Owen and Dave have, you know, exemplary of that, and once again, please make the most of it. Thank you so much, guys.